Yesterday I was speaking about how at some point an insight just happens in relation to the concepts. Lots of insights. Not, sometimes we wait for one big thing to happen, whereas actually the understanding is the deliverance of a lot of little pieces of the puzzle. And once enough pieces of the puzzle are delivered, life is seen differently. And each piece of the puzzle can undo a certain part of the old belief system. And remembering, one of the things we've been talking about here is that when the doer tries to do understanding, when the doer tries to do stopping, it is misunderstanding functioning even more. So when the doer tries to stop, it's the doer running even faster. When the doer, which is misunderstanding, tries to understand, it's just more misunderstanding. So the click of getting what the pointers are pointing at just happens one day. When you're going about your life, something happens, and the circumstance is just so clear that, I haven't ever seen this before. And we really see what the concept is pointing at. The concept that says, for example, human unhappiness, human suffering is a form of thinking. So we understand that intellectually, but it's asking us to see it, so to feel the suffering when it arises. And if we feel the suffering, we realize this is a form of thinking, understanding that feeling is actually just an intensified, concentrated thought. And there's hundreds of these little insights that can happen. And so this morning, and this is not the first time at all, I think it makes sense that someone says this. They said, I understand that in theory we're not the doers. But I don't quite get it. Or I don't quite believe it. And that's interesting to me, that this is the case, that someone says, I don't get it. So then my thinking is, okay, so this is very important. This is the key to actually see that everything that is happening is a happening and not my doing. And if we keep going around with, so one of the concepts that points to this is everything that happens in the moment is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the suggestion is that we have to see this for ourselves, not just understand the theory. Now, when I thought about it, I realized, this could be confusing, because in a way it can be confusing because we're never going to be able to see our genes. They don't appear on the skin like a spot. And we're never going to be able to see our up-to-date conditioning. There isn't a box that we can open up and go, oh, look, there's my up-to-date conditioning. It's not a tangible thing that we can observe. What the concept is pointing at is the fact that there is a biological instrument that has a psychological component to it as well, a lot of the time. That's where the suffering comes from, the psychological component of the instrument. And that instrument is designed, is created, exists as a result of these two factors, your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so what the concept is pointing at, what we can see, is not the genes and up-to-date conditioning, but the product of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so when the concept says everything is a happening and not your doing, and the happening happens according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which you were never in control of. So what does it mean by what happens is a happening? This is what we have to see, and then when we see it, we can work backwards and say, oh yeah, that happened because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So we don't see the genes and up-to-date conditioning. What we see is the happening. So an example of this is you're sitting, this morning we were talking in the breakfast room, sitting in the breakfast room, and let's say one of the people that's cleaning up the plates and drops a whole bunch of plates and glasses on the floor, and there's a big smash. And so automatically what happens a lot of the time is our head will turn to see what has happened. So whatever happens in each moment is the only thing that can happen according to one's genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in. So the body is sitting at a table in a breakfast room, and in that situation, a bunch of plates and glasses fall to the ground and smash. That is the circumstance. The body hears something, hears the smash. The body is not in control of whether it hears the smash or not. The function of awareness is always functioning, and so it can't help but be aware of what is in the environment. Those aspects that are in the environment that fit within the field of awareness, and we can look at it within the scope of the senses. So the sound of the siren is heard. We don't have to make effort to hear it. It's in the field of awareness, and so it is automatically heard. So the sound of the breaking plates happens, not something I was in control of. And as a result, the body automatically, the head moves. Now, that was a happening and not my doing. When we look at it, there wasn't someone that said, I have heard this sound, and so now I need to control the steering wheel of the body and the particular lever of the head and turn the head. That would be hard work if there was someone doing all of this in life. And yet, the belief in personal doership is exactly this belief that believes there is some entity that is controlling the movements of the body. So the pumping of the heart, we can quite easily see that that is mechanical. There isn't a feeling that comes from an identification with being the heart. And so there isn't a feeling that I am the doer of that. But certain other faculties in the body come with a sense of a controller. And so that sense, which isn't really the problem, the feeling that I am in control of moving my hands and the feeling that I'm in control of the thoughts, is actually a gift. That is the gift of the feeling of free will. So we have the feeling of free will. What happens is we analyze the experience on the surface often, and so from a young age this feeling of free will has been put in place from about the age of even less than, when the baby starts realizing, oh, this seems to be my hand, I can control it. Then at that point the feeling of free will has come in. At a very early age, the baby has no intellectual, the brain intellect hasn't solidified to a point where it understands that certain objects of the body belong to it. And then at some point it realizes it can pick things up rather than it just being a reflex that happens. So there is a sense of control that comes in. And then at the age of 2.5 or 3, something even more significant kicks in, which is the belief in a me. So that's when the belief of the me, the doer, comes in. And then at that age, the claiming, this is mine, you can't have mine, that's yours, but mine is here. And the tantruming to get what it wants starts to happen. Now that happens as a further progression of the feeling of free will. It happens when a certain belief system gets put in place. The belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Now that belief in personal doership makes sense that it gets put in place because the experience is that I am doing things. So the experience of doing things comes before, and once it's there for long enough, the brain concludes, I am the doer, because the feeling, the experience is I am the doer. And so this is very subtle in what we're talking about here. The feeling of doership is a gift. If that dissolves, then we will feel like we are a slave or a robot or a puppet at the end of a string being controlled. And thankfully, that doesn't happen. The feeling of free will remains there. What I mean by the feeling of free will is that in practice, I feel like I can stand up whenever I want. I don't feel like I am handcuffed to the chair. If I choose, I can stand up, I can raise my hand, and it feels like I have the free will to do that. When we investigate life, we see that that free will is a feeling that thankfully is there, but actually what happens, the raising of the hand, the standing up, is controlled by factors that are out of our control. The movement is all mechanical, and mechanical in relation to the environment around us. So going back to the sound of the glass breaking and the head turning, it happens automatically, a cause and effect, and the effect happens according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. If I was deaf and that happened, my head wouldn't move probably, because my genes are different, which means the happening is going to happen according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So my genes means that the sense of hearing is inactive, which means the stimulus of the sound isn't there, and it doesn't create a reaction of turning my head. And then, so that on a simple investigation can become understood, and as we see it more and more for ourselves, we see that whatever is happening in the flow of life is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. The more we see it, the more we understand, not just intellectually, but like I can't see it any other way. Every time I investigate anything that happens in life, I see it's a result of an external factor that we can call a stimulus or a cause, and then that cause is registered by the body and by awareness that is functioning through the body, and a reaction happens in the body, and whatever happens in the body is essentially mechanical, including, and this is the bit that has to be seen most clearly, including thinking. Because if we think that the thoughts are not mechanical, if we think that the thoughts are my doing, then everything that follows on from something that is considered to be my doing is then going to be taken as my doing also. When we see that a thought arises as a result of the circumstance we find ourselves in and the genes and up-to-date conditioning, then we see, even that thought is like the head turning. So I can ask you, what is your name? And an answer comes. The answer is effectively a thought in vocal form. So if I ask you to think about your next thought, which doesn't require a vocal answer, the question or the suggestion to think about your next thought is a stimulus that you weren't in control of. It happened in the situation you found yourself in. So the suggestion to tell me what your next thought is going to be is the stimulus that creates a sequence of thinking. Whatever thinking happens after I ask you to tell me what your next thought is going to be is your next thought. So you might, as soon as I say, what is your next thought? The thought is, well, that's interesting. That's your next thought. We're never aware of what our next thought is going to be until it happens. And it happens not because we control it, but because a stimulus, it could even be a previous thought of our own, which is really just a happening, is the stimulus to the next thought. And so when we have a conversation in our head, or we are working out a problem in our head, it is a series of cause and effect, cause and effect. So the process of thinking is a process that feeds itself in a good way sometimes when we are trying to work out a problem. We start and the thinking delivers an answer, and then that answer to the first part of the problem becomes the catalyst for the next lot of thinking.
Yeah, talking about puppets at the end of the string. You said, thankfully we have a sense of free choice. But if we would understand that we have, in reality, have no choice, it would allow not to feel guilt and blame.
Mm-hmm.
If I have no choice, I'm not guilty. If you have no choice, I will not blame you.
Mm-hmm. Let's change the word choice for free will here.
Okay. Sense of free will.
No, not sense of free will, but actual free will.
Okay, actual free will.
Yeah.
But
so if the human being understands that there is no free will, meaning, so the definition of free will is that there is no independent entity that is in complete control of everything that they think, feel, and do.
Okay, but I know that you will say it's paradox, but everything you and just not you, not just you speak leads to conclusion that in reality there is no free will. Actually, there is no free will.
Great.
But
yes.
we have we think that we have free will.
Yes. So let's make a distinction about the feeling of free will versus the belief in free will. So the feeling of free will is a gift. I'm very glad it's there. I would not wish for the feeling of free will to dissolve. If the feeling of free will, which remember, a feeling doesn't mean that free will exists. It just means that there is a feeling of free will. If the feeling of free will dissolved, my experience of life would change radically, not necessarily for the better. I would then feel like, well, the experience of life would be very different. I feel, even without suffering arising in life, I feel like in each moment I can do whatever I feel like doing. That's how life presents. Deep down I understand that even though I feel that I can do whatever I feel like doing in each moment, whatever is picked, whatever option is picked, I know that that is completely predetermined, completely out of my control, a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I didn't choose. So there is this great feeling of free will, or a feeling that I can do anything, which is my aspects of feeling free. But when that's accompanied with the understanding that really there is no free will, it's the best of both worlds. Because with the understanding that really there is no free will, I don't blame the other and don't feel guilt for what happens, which is what you started off saying, that if the belief in free will is not there, then I won't blame the other and I won't feel guilt. I agree completely. That is what dissolves and allows the dissolving of guilt, blame and pride. But in the belief of free will dissolving, the good news is that our feeling of free will remains. Now, where the whole thing became a problem, the good news is that we get to feel like I am free and understand very deeply that my free will is actually God's will. The feeling, the free will, the movement that happens, that feels like my free will, can be understood to be God's will. And then what we get to see is that, my feeling of free will in the moment and what I do as a result of that is actually God's will. That there is no difference between God's will and what results as a product of my feeling of free will. What dissolves is the belief in my free will. Where this all went wrong is when the feeling of free will developed in the young baby, child, and then the feeling of free will, which was part of the experience, was registered by awareness and the baby, the child, and says, well, it feels like I'm free. So my conclusion is, I have free will. I am a separate, independent, autonomous entity that is in control of everything that I think, everything that I feel, and everything that I do. That is the belief system that gets put in place as a result of the experience being a certain way. So things went wrong when the feeling of free will arose and when the brain interpreted that to mean I have free will. That problem, so when we look at it, the problem is not the feeling of free will. The problem is the belief that gets put in place as a result of that feeling that says, I have free will. Life takes us through a process of pointing out the differences, pointing out all of the mechanics of life, pointing out that actually we have no free will. Trying to undo the belief that was put in place at a young age and was reinforced by society, all of which have the same belief that was put in place at the same young age because of the same feeling of free will. And so our belief in free will is continuously reinforced by society blaming the other and feeling guilty, which we do as well when the belief of free will is in place. And it's also continually reinforced by the fact that the experience is an experience whereby I feel like I have free will. And so until the working mind receives information that says, hey, you have the feeling of free will, that's a great thing. The feeling of free will is a gift. But the belief that has formed afterwards that says, you are the doer, you actually are a separate independent entity that thinks and acts completely independent of anything else, because that essentially is what the doer principle is. A belief that there is some entity that is separate, completely independent from everything else, that thinks, that acts. It says that is a mistake. Check out for yourself that whatever happens in each moment is a result of the biological makeup and the psychological makeup, which is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that you had no control over, and see that speaking happens as a result of a question that is asked, which is a stimulus in the environment. See that the body moves according to stimulus in the environment. And if we see this, the belief in free will dissolves. It becomes clear, I am not the doer, everything is a happening. I have never done anything of my own absolute free will, and yet I've always had the feeling of free will. So when this is clear, we can exclaim, I simply cannot be the doer. Everything is happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So Ramesh used to put forward a suggested practice, which once again, when we look at it, is not necessarily a practice because it's just a happening that happens after we're exposed to a certain amount of new conditioning. So talking about the practice is new conditioning that life is delivering, and at some point we might have the thought, I'm going to do this self-investigation, which when we look at it, is not my doing, because the thought arises in an instant, and then as a result of the thought I'm going to participate in this self-investigation. We sit down and follow the suggested instructions of this practice. So Ramesh would call it the personal investigation of your own. So he said, pick a time during the day where you can sit quietly for 10 or 15 minutes. He said, you don't need to sit in a special position. You can even take a cup of tea or coffee or beer or sherry. He used to say sherry. With you. But the only suggestion, requirement is that you sit quietly where you won't be disturbed. And you take one event during the day that you are convinced was your doing. Many others, you say, I'm not sure, maybe my doing, maybe not my doing, but this one event, I'm convinced that was my doing. And then do a simple investigation of what happened. And we'll find that in investigating the event that you are convinced is your doing, that you found yourself in a particular situation where you saw something, you heard something, you tasted something, you touched something, or you smelt something. And as a result of seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, or smelling something that you weren't in control of, a reaction in the body happened. A thought arose, or the body moved, or a thought arose and then the body moved. And as a result of that, the circumstance was now different, whereby you continued to see, smell, taste, or touch, or hear something, and that same process carries on until eventually there is an outcome. Or we can see that there are outcomes all the way along this process. And investigating this, we see that what happened in the circumstance was not in our control. So the glasses breaking was not something that we determined, not something we controlled. It happened, and the sound was heard. We heard something. As a result of that, the head turned. The head turned as a result of the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the circumstance. The circumstance includes the stimuli which we saw, heard, tasted, smelt, or touched. And even complex series of happenings can be broken down into this simple investigation. And if we do this every day for a period of time, let's say every day for 30 days, before doing this, we would say, well, I've been told that everything's a happening, but I'm not convinced. After doing it the first day, we might find that we have to conclude, true, something happened in the environment, it acted as a stimuli, and when the stimuli was received by this body-mind organism, a reaction happened, either thought, feeling, or physical, or words spoken. And at the end of that investigation, what I thought was my doing actually appears to be a happening according to everything that came before. A happening according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning that came before and I wasn't in control of, and according to the stimuli that came before that I wasn't in control of. And if the investigation is done for a second day, and a third day, and a 25th day, and the 30th day, what we might see is that each day, having picked a happening or an event that we were convinced was my doing, we might find, time and time again, we find and see that it is a happening and not my doing. And at the end of 30 days, having started the process, saying, well, I've been told everything is a happening and not my doing, but frankly, I'm not sure. After 30 days of investigating these events, finding each time not my doing a happening, we might find that we no longer can possibly think that anything is my doing because we've done this specific investigation. And if someone came to us and said, hey, I heard someone telling you to do this personal investigation of your own. Frankly, I'm not convinced myself either that I'm not the doer. And you, now having gone through 30 days of this investigation, will say to them, well, you know, I was in the same position, but I have to tell you, I'm absolutely convinced that we are not the doer and everything that happens in life is a happening. Simply because day after day after day, you have investigated a situation for yourself based on your own experience and found not my doing.
If we look the broader picture, it leads to the conclusion that we spoke yesterday about time and space, and everything is obviously written from the beginning of time, of time to the end of time. Today is, for example, 2017, and all our experience is already, let's say, written in some level, and it will happen what will happen, and we just have, you said, we feel we have free choice.
Which is part of what is happening.
Yeah, but could we say we have illusion, we have free choice? It sounds nice, but yeah.
So this is why I use the word, we have the feeling of free will. That's undeniable. The feeling is there. All we need to see is that the feeling is not necessarily a reflection of what is really available.
Okay, but what is really?
What is really happening is that there is a bunch of biological instruments functioning in life, mechanically. But the experience of life is an experience of not biological instruments. Biological instruments means robots, essentially. The experience of life is, when we go to it, an experience where I don't feel like a robot. I feel like a human being with free will. And I'm glad I feel like a human being with free will. I don't want to feel like a robot.
Yeah, but I don't like if I am robot. Because if I feel like I'm human being and actually I'm a robot, yeah. What a duck, what science says.
You just want to know the truth, is what you're saying. So let's see, are we only a robot? The human being, is the human being only a robot? And the question is, no, the human being isn't only a robot. The definition in this teaching is that the human being, which previously was seen to be a physical entity, completely separate from everything else. So our initial experience of the human being was not that we're a robot, but it was the experience that I am this physical entity and I live in an objective world and I am essentially physical, the body. The fact that consciousness is functioning through that body is usually not even part of the equation. We don't even register that the body that I believe myself or feel myself to be, what I am is the body. Sometimes we don't even recognize that there is an aspect of consciousness. And if that aspect of consciousness is recognized, it is assumed to be of the body. So essentially, it's assumed that the consciousness comes after the body. So the subject is the body. The source is the body. That's how we knew ourselves. I am the body. This realization or shift that life takes us through reveals something different about who we are. And the concept, the description, the words put onto what is realized is that what I am is the human being. So that's what we said we were before. I am the human being. But our understanding of the human being was essentially the body as a separate entity, the body as the subject, and consciousness, if it was even brought into the equation, was a product of the body. And so if someone were to attack the body, or life attacked the body, and the body became less, then what I know myself as has become less. That's our old paradigm. The description here of what a human being is different to that. You are not a separate, independent, physical, alone object. What the human being is a combination of impersonal consciousness of source, the body-mind organism as a vehicle into which impersonal consciousness links or identifies, and then functions through the body as personal consciousness. So the human being, according to the concept, is not what we thought it was, but rather the combination of impersonal consciousness of source, the body as an instrument or a vehicle, and then the personal consciousness. So what is mechanical? What is robotic? What is mechanical and robotic is the vehicle through which consciousness of source functions. And the human being is not just the body. The human being is actually source functioning through the robotic vehicle. So it's a bit like someone getting into a car or getting into a train or a roller coaster. And the vehicle is mechanical. But what experiences the experience is not mechanical. So what we are at our core is not robotic. What we are at our core is the very opposite of mechanical and robotic. It's consciousness, it's I. A robot can never have the sense of existence. The robot can never have the function of awareness. The robot is effectively a machine, a computer. So if I tell you, you're a machine, your experience tells you, no, I'm not. So why is there all this effort pointing at the mechanical aspect of the human being? in order for the mechanical to be seen as mechanical, which then allows the non-mechanical to be realized. For as long as there is an identification with the mechanical aspects of the human being and an identification with those aspects as being what I am, the core of the human being, the essence, goes unnoticed. And that is what is referred to as identification with, in traditional teachings, identification with the body, identification with thoughts, identification with emotions. And that is referred to as not knowing oneself, of forgetting oneself, the veil that covers up one's true nature. And so we have practices in various traditions, like the practice of neti-neti. So anything that you can observe, anything that changes, is not what you are. And so say, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not my thoughts that come and go, I'm not my emotions. And the process is to eliminate everything that you are not, to eventually, hopefully leave that which we are that hasn't been eliminated to stand on its own and be seen by itself. So this methodology is pointing out the aspects of the human being that are mechanical, which is the vehicle, which is what allows us to have this particular experience of life and experience through this particular vehicle. In another manifestation, Source could create a world that is completely different to the world we know, with different laws, which wouldn't even be called laws of physics. It's a different world. Who knows what the framework of that manifestation will be. And life will be experienced from a different perspective, maybe not through an instrument. That doesn't require an instrument in order for life to be experienced, except in a manifestation where that is the condition of the manifestation. So in the manifestation of life as we know it, everything that we can observe tells us that in this manifestation, the rule that Source has put in place when it created the manifestation, the rule is that Source requires a vehicle in order to function through, in order to experience this manifestation, this world.
A mechanical part includes thoughts and emotions.
Say this again.
A mechanical part includes thoughts and emotions.
Yes, yes.
The only which is not mechanical is awareness or we.
Awareness and the sense of existence, yes, the I.
Yeah, that's the reason why Nisargadatta said, I leave my life to goes as it goes, and I remain as myself.
Yes. Effectively, in that situation, he's pointing to himself as the witness. The body will act as the body is going to act, not my concern, not my business. I remain as I am. Which is the realization of the sage. This is why it's said that the sage has no karma. Because karma, which means cause and effect, is part of the flow of life. And the sage has realized that what they are in essence is not part of the flow of life. The flow of life is all mechanical. The laws of physics, which essentially are what the body follows, and even thinking is simply electromagnetics happening in a neural network. So even thinking is physics. The flow of life is all physics. Karma is part of the flow of life. And a sage that realizes what I am stands untouched by the flow of life. What I am is not part of the flow of life, but prior to the flow of life, that which is aware of the flow of life, that in which the flow of life happens, that in which lila, the play of life, arises. that alone is what I am. And so from that realization, what someone was calling the sage's karma, what the sage himself prior to realization would have called his karma, is now seen to be the body's karma. And so the sage says, I am now free of karma, which technically doesn't mean that the sage no longer has karma, because the sage, so even these teachings that are put forward by a sage saying this is not truth, because the sage is actually never separate from the body. The sage ultimately is a combination of both the awareness and the experience of the body. But for an awakening teaching that is trying to bring light on the aspect of the human that hasn't been seen, a separation needs to be created. And so from an awakening point of view, it's fair to say, I am that which is untouched by what is happening in the flow of life, to separate oneself from the body. And then once that realization has happened, that yes, I am that which is untouched, the process says, yes, but you don't live life in that position. Life isn't meant to be lived where you are the formless witness of life, but rather you have to live life feeling that you are the human experience. Live life as if you are the human. So that understanding that what I am essentially is awareness or consciousness gets integrated into daily living, where a sage like Ramesh says, what I am is that living as this. Ramesh didn't used to say, I am that. Ramesh's guru, Nisargadatta Maharaj, would say, I am that. So the main teaching of Nisargadatta is in a book called I Am That, because that teaching was an awakening teaching to that which has been forgotten. And so the pointer was, I am that, not this. And then the next teaching that came along, Ramesh's teaching, says, actually, after I realized that I am that, a deeper living experience comes in, which is not to say that Nisargadatta didn't have the deeper living experience, but the teaching from Nisargadatta was pointing at just I am that. Ramesh is saying, after we realize I am that, the living experience is living, knowing I am that, living as this. And so to fully embody that experience, we then say, I am this, knowing that this is actually that. So I'm not sure where we started in all of that. I hope that I ended up answering. What was the initial question?
Can you just repeat this last sentence? So that this is actually that. So I'm that living as this.
This, yes.
So finally, this is actually that.
Yeah. So before seeking, we just say, I am this. The seeking process takes us through a journey that brings about an awakening to, oh, I am that in essence. And then the journey can continue where that realization that I am that in essence gets integrated, the understanding gets integrated in such a way that life continues to be lived as the story dictates. The story dictates you don't live your life as that. That's not how this story is written. You realize you are that, and then the story progresses, and the realization you are that is part of the story of life. And then the story progresses to integrate that understanding such that the sage ends up living as this, but understanding what this is, different to the initial understanding that says, I am this. The sage lives as if they are this, understanding that this is actually that. That living as this, meaning source having a human experience. So that means I live as Roger, experiencing life as if I am Roger the body, but always connected to source, meaning always aware of my connection to source. My connection to source means that in each moment, the fact that there is awareness in the sense of existence, aware of what is happening through the body, means that source is functioning through the body. So no longer is there the assumption, the false assumption, that the consciousness is exclusively of the body, but rather the understanding that the consciousness functioning through the body is actually source inhabiting and functioning through the body, which means whenever there is awareness of the daily life experience, that must mean that source is functioning through the body, which means we live life always connected to source, understanding that whatever happens in life through me and through the others is a result not of a me, but a result of source functioning through this body. And therefore, the idea in personal doership has been completely annihilated. The attachment to outcomes has been annihilated because it's understood that even though on a physical level life is pleasure or pain, on a deeper level what I am is self-fulfilling and self-contenting. We can rest in this place of being and still life can happen. Life can happen through the body while remaining in this place of being, which means while remaining connected to source. So I am that, living as this. So in saying I am that, living as this, there is an understanding that this ultimately is that. I am that, living as this. So if we go to Christianity as to show how Christianity effectively is not Christianity as a religion or as an institution. The story of life has meant that even wisdom teachings get diluted down and used for other purposes, where sometimes the message delivered through the institution is very different to how the message can be read when we read the teachings with a non-dual perspective, let's say. And so the teachings of Jesus were delivered in a way that would appeal to those that could only understand dualistic language, but for anyone who is able to see the metaphor and see what is pointed at deeper down, we can see the non-dual message in it. And so when he talks about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, which is three but not three, three but one, three is one, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So I am that, living as this. That is the Father. This as the body and the experience of being human is the Son. And the Holy Spirit represents the link between the Father, the Source, and the body. And the Son is a combination of the body and the Spirit. And the Spirit is an extension of the Father or Source. So when Jesus proclaimed, I am the Son of God, Jesus wasn't saying, I, Jesus, am the son of God, but he's saying everyone is the sons and daughters of God. We just don't see it. We don't know it. This is why in a lot of the parables and stories, he was portrayed as a healer of the blind. And in the stories, he would heal those that physically couldn't see. But actually, he's talking about allowing people to see beyond the belief, beyond the experience as it presents for a certain period of time. So trying to push the awareness into realms that it hasn't been aware of. And it hasn't been aware of it, not because the awareness is not capable at a certain point in time, but rather because certain beliefs that say other things that keep the experience restricted are there. So the beliefs need to get changed, need to get addressed, and when the beliefs get addressed, awareness automatically sees a bigger picture.
There's one more thing. It's this kind of belief that implies changes, like if there would be no free will, we would still live as slaves, let's say, or because there is this belief that somebody decided, enough, and we make a change. So, and it's very strongly cultivated. So it's, maybe you can say a few words about this. So it's like predetermined that Martin Luther King decided in the moment that he wants to make a change, or then it loses some, like you say, some poetry in this sense is lost, no, because there is actually no savior, or it loses taste a little bit, no, the stories.
It loses taste when the story is being read by the sense of personal doership that feels that the only purpose in life is to achieve. And so if the sense of personal doership hears this, then it says, well, I didn't do it. And it says, I don't like the sound of that. Well, you're taking away any of my glory. And so the sense of personal doership that is convinced that its purpose in life is to win. And all it is trying to do is to succeed in things, which essentially is to win. It wants to be better than the other. If the sense of personal doership achieves something and everyone else achieves it as well, then it doesn't feel satisfied. It wants to achieve something that no one else has achieved so it can feel good. And we can see that the belief in personal doership is always moving to get more and more. So when someone achieves more than they could ever spend in terms of financial gain, which is really just part of the story, they haven't really achieved it, it was their destiny for that to happen. If the sense of personal doership is strong, they won't be satisfied, even though they have achieved more than anyone else. So they could, they'll want to journal this, they'll want to keep reminding themselves that they've made more than anyone else, and yet internally it won't be enough. They'll still be driven to make even more, because the sense of personal doership is convinced that its fulfillment, its wholeness, will come from winning. And each time it wins, it finds it doesn't satisfy. But because it doesn't learn its lesson, it keeps the same principle in place, being convinced that the purpose of life is to win, and so it tries to win more. And no matter how much more it gets, it will be unsatisfied. And in some cases, there's this realization, and the need for more stops, and a different search is engaged in. So when we hear that the story of life is predetermined, and that all of the events, including the heroes in life, were destined to do what they did exactly according to the story of life. From one perspective, it loses its shine. But from another perspective, we can look at it as an amazing story, an amazing creation. When we watch a story on television or read a book, the story is fiction. It's made up. And yet, it's interesting. It's a masterpiece. Life, with the belief in personal doership and all of the suffering, can be seen as an amazing creation, a masterpiece. And when it starts to be appreciated for what it is and not, and the false idea of fulfillment falls away, we find that our own being is fulfillment. And so we don't need some idea of fulfillment. So in each moment we are fulfilled, and at the same time as being fulfilled, we are part of the amazing creation of life. So it gets appreciated from that point of view. So let's talk a little bit about choice, which you mentioned, and free will and control. In the teaching, it points at the fact that whatever happens is completely predetermined. From the beginning of the story to the end of the story, everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. Nothing could happen differently. Ramesh would say the story has been written, acted and directed, produced, and is in the can. And what we are seeing is the moment by moment playing of the story that is in the can. Now, is there choice? And the answer is yes, there is choice. And someone might think, this is strange. You just finished saying that everything is completely predetermined, it's in the can. And then to the question, is there choice? You are saying yes. This, I have to say, is another of those areas that I had a lot of trouble with when I was listening to the teaching for the first time. Ramesh not only said there's choice, he would give a talk, more or less like I have been saying, where we say there is absolutely no free will. Everything that happens according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the laws of physics. There is no me-doer. And then he would say, yet there is choice and the sense of free will. And so, no, you can't. There is no choice. Everything is unfolding exactly as it's destined. And he'd say, yes, I agree. But there is choice and there is free will. And I kept saying to him, how can you have choice and free will when everything is unfolding exactly as it unfolds and it couldn't unfold differently? I just couldn't understand that the two could exist simultaneously and not be contradictions. And eventually, because it was my destiny for this point not to just fall away as irrelevant, I kept thinking about it. I kept having arguments and debates in my head with Ramesh. Even when I wasn't there, I'd have, back and forth discussions about this, which means they were just arising as a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, including the fact that I had been in Mumbai sitting in satsang and had these conversations with Ramesh. So the contemplating happened. And at some point I realized what he was saying is, if we look at, so there's the theory, which theory doesn't mean it's just theory. It means theory means that's how it is on one level. But the theory and practice can be different. And because practice is different, it doesn't make the theory wrong. And because the theory says something that happens differently in practice doesn't make the theory wrong. This is where we see that the two can be seemingly contradictions, but actually paradoxes. And so what he was saying is, yes, on deep investigation, we see that everything is a spontaneous arising in consciousness, an experience in the present moment. There is no cause and effect, there is no time and space, it's just an arising in consciousness. Or we can say everything is a happening according to God's will, and it unfolds according to laws of physics and cosmic law, which includes one's genes and up-to-date conditioning being the two factors that make up the human on a biological and a psychological level, and everything that unfolds is completely predetermined. So that's the theory. That's what we see when we look deep down beyond the surface. But what is spontaneously created? The experience that is happening quite clearly is an experience that unfolds as if cause and effect are real, as if time and space is real. Right? So if we say time doesn't exist, on the one hand we're correct, because we can look deeply into time and come to the conclusion that in theory time doesn't exist. Time is illusory. But on the surface, life is always lived as if time is real. So Ramesh was saying, please see that time doesn't exist, but then don't hold on to a belief that doesn't hold true in our experience of daily living. Hold the concept, let go of the belief, and hold two concepts. One concept says, theoretically, and on very deep investigation, we find that time doesn't exist, that cause and effect doesn't actually exist. But in practice, the experience is designed to be an experience of time, an experience of cause and effect. So we can then hold another concept that says, in practice, time exists. In practice, cause and effect is the mechanism by which life happens. And because we're holding them as concepts, not as beliefs, they can exist simultaneously. The best example of this that people don't dispute, probably because they might not have really looked into it or seem, oh, well, it's irrelevant, I don't need to really think about this, is the existence of quantum physics and mechanical physics. When you look deeply into mechanical physics, we find that the laws of mechanical physics don't exist. Newtonian physics, mechanical physics, when you go deep enough, the constants are not there, they fall apart. They're no longer observable. On the surface, there are a whole lot of constants in the experience of life, which allow the laws of mechanical physics to be conceptualized and put into concept form. Similarly speaking, when we go deep and investigate quantum physics, we find that there are certain conclusions that can be put into conceptual form about quantum physics. And the two concepts of quantum physics and mechanical physics seem to be contradictory, and yet, in practice, life is lived on the basis of mechanical physics. We build houses based on Newtonian physics, not quantum physics. And so, for us to say, actually, when we look deeply into mechanical physics, it doesn't exist. So let's throw all the laws of mechanical physics out. Let's say they don't exist, would be to make a big mistake. It would be to not see things as they really are on all levels. So for us to say that there is no choice is to overlook that in the experience of life, what is predetermined unfolds according to many, many choices in each day made by every human being. Now, once again, we have to look at definition. If we're going to look at the definition behind choice, ordinarily, because of the belief in personal doership, so many words in the English language, which are verbs, action, words describing an action, presuppose a doer in them, in the definition, because society, humanity, believes they are the doers. So obviously the English language says playing, or thinking, or choice. These are choosing. These are verbs, doing words. And so there is an assumption that there is a doer doing them. So when we say choice, we automatically assume my choice. When we redefine the word as choice happening, which means the doer has been taken out of the definition, we can see that choice does happen. Not choice is my choice, but let's look at what the definition choice really is. Choice is a result of finding a circumstance where there are, let's say, 10 options available in a particular circumstance. So an example we can use is being at a restaurant and having 10 items on the menu. You also have the option of not ordering anything. You have the option of going to another restaurant. You have an option of ordering and staying quiet. You have the option of ordering using sign language. You know, all sorts of different options. But in any situation, there are many, many options. So just let's look at the 10 options on the menu card to keep it simple. That is the circumstance we find ourselves in, and based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, the circumstance is observed, and at some point, a choice is made. A choice simply means the mechanics of picking one of the 10 options. And we can't deny that even though there is no doer, there never has been a doer entity in life. And there never will be a doer entity in life. Life has always been happening mechanically. We can't deny that choice, as part of the mechanics, is a very significant part of daily life. Everyone is always choosing. The only thing we need to see is that, yes, choice happens, but it's not as I used to interpret it. The choice that happens through this body is not my choice as a doer, but rather the choice that was destined to happen according to God's will. So then we find that what is predetermined unfolds moment after moment after moment through the mechanism of choice. And then we might realize, I've been going around saying there is no choice, there is no choice. Why we were saying that is because we realized there is no doer choosing. And so now we've said there is no doer, so there can't be any choice. It's true, there is no personal choice of me as a doer. But let's become a little bit more accurate and say, there is choice. Otherwise we're deluded. Otherwise we go around saying, there's no choice. There's choice happening every day. We just need to redefine the definition of choice. And the same can be said with free will and the sense of free will. If we say there is no free will, that's correct. We see that there is no me to have free will. What I mean by me, this fictitious phantom that thinks it is in control of everything that's happening mechanically. So when it's seen that there is no entity, there is just genes and up-to-date conditioning, a biological instrument, a machine functioning, then we say there is no free will. But what about the feeling of free will that remains even when it's completely seen that there is no doer? That the feeling of free will that Ramana had. Ramana didn't feel like he was strapped to the chair and was only unstrapped when God allowed him to be unstrapped. And when God unstrapped him, God was essentially dragging him to the next place. That's not the sage's experience, right? the sage still has the feeling of free will, thankfully. Otherwise it would be an unpleasant existence. So the sage has the feeling of free will, knowing that their feeling of free will is illusory. That their feeling of free will is there. I'll say, thank you very much for giving me the feeling of free will, knowing that I actually don't have free will. And so if I go around saying, I have no feeling of free will, it's not accurate. If I go around saying, I have no free will, I have no control, then that's accurate. But the feeling of free will, we have to acknowledge, yes, it's here. And the feeling of free will isn't what causes suffering. That's why I say the feeling of free will is a gift. It's the belief in free will that causes the suffering.
If I go back a little bit to the choice, it's like from my observation, if I'm right, I just want to see it's that the choice is made because of our makeup which we have. Like when something happened, I saw that if it's feeling good or maybe just I got a thought, the choice is made.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right, or if it's maybe?
Yeah, exactly. So this morning, when you asked, do we want to go for a walk?
Yes.
A circumstance was there and a stimuli. We heard something, saw, tasted, touched, felt. What we heard was your question, do you want to go for a walk? And each of the people at the table made a choice. Yes or no. And when we investigate that, the choice was a result of the circumstance and the person's genes and up-to-date conditioning at that point in time. And so what seems like my choice is a result of these factors. But in the moment when I say, yes, I feel like going for a walk, or no, I don't feel like going for a walk, it doesn't feel like that choice has been imposed on me. It feels like I made it. It feels like it's my free will. And so that's the gift, that it feels like my free will. But when I look at it deeply, I see that that choice was the only choice I could have made in that moment. If everything that came before in life was different, then the situation and the choice would be different. So the only reason that choice was made that way is because everything that came before was the way it was. And if I made a different choice, it would be because everything that came before was different, slightly or radically different. So yes.
Thank you.
On this note, Ramesh would include this pointer. It said that we are not in control, both in theory and in practice. So control is different to choice and free will. Control is a word that we can look at and say, oh, I am not in control. So both in theory and in practice, we are not in control. In theory, the decision that gets made is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So we can say, in theory, I am not in control of the decision that gets made. And then in practice, we also see that I am not in control of the outcome. I make a decision to have orange juice on the menu as a result of the circumstance and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. I place the order with the waiter, and 2 minutes later he comes back, either with my orange juice or with no orange juice. If he comes back with no orange juice, he might say, look, I'm very sorry, but there's no oranges in the kitchen. And either way, whether I get what I want or I don't get what I want, it's not because I had control, but because of the destined story of life. So both in theory, I'm not in control, and in practice, I'm not in control. And yet, right in the middle, at the point of choice, there is the feeling that I am in control, which is great. Please don't take that away from me. with the deep understanding that both in theory and in practice, I'm not in control. Now, what's interesting for me was at some point, a couple of years ago, I had to visit a neurologist because I had a facial paralysis and some other functions that weren't quite working as they normally did, some brain functions and what have you. And the neurologist, after the second visit, was just having some conversation, and he said, what do you do in life? And I said, well, okay, I travel around and give some talks on happiness in daily living. And he seemed interested. He said, so summarize, he's a busy man, summarize what's the essence of the teaching. And automatically the thought came up, and it said the essence of the teaching is that we are not in as much control as we may think in life. And a realization of this on a deep level is not as tragic as the mind might think. In fact, it creates a great amount of freedom and peace of mind in daily living. This is a neurologist who was in his 70s, has been working as a neurologist for 60 years, spends, I guess, most of his days dealing with people that are no longer able to control the functions of the body in the way that is considered normal because of some neurological disorder. And as soon as I finished speaking, the neurologist said, but we are in control. I can move my hand to the right, I can move my hand to the left. And in that moment, I realized how deeply ingrained this belief of being a doer is. Because here is a neurologist who is presented every day with people that are no longer able to control their arm, not because they choose not to control their arm, but because the brain has broken or malfunctioned or stopped working in its optimal fashion. Instantaneously a change happens because of a biological, physiological event that happens. And here is a man that isn't just capable of observing neurology on a surface level, but actually has gone through studies that allow him to see and observe neurology on a much more deep sort of observation basis, using fine instruments, etc., and having studied texts that come from... So this isn't to say the man is stupid, far from it. He probably is in the top 5% of intellectually intelligent people. It just shows that the feeling of free will and the belief that says we are in control is so deep that even a man that's working with the physiology of a body hasn't clicked that what happens in each moment is not a result of someone choosing, but as a result of the functioning of a machine. And when the machine breaks, certain functions stop. So, and especially the function of thinking. It doesn't take much in the way of the brain being disturbed for thoughts to change radically, for memory to stop functioning, for stimuli on the outside to have a significantly different impact on the body.
My question is, who has the feeling of the free will? The awareness, or is there some doer in another quality?
So life is always an experience, and that means that the feeling of free will is also a component of the experience, and what is aware of the experience is awareness. But awareness and experience are not two. So essentially, the feeling of free will is there because it is an object in the experience. What is aware of the experience is experience itself. Experience is self-aware. If we look at it from the deep non-dual perspective. When we use language, we will say that there is experience and then there is awareness of the experience, just to make things clearer for a while. But that then doesn't actually imply to, well, it can imply to if it's heard by that, but it can also imply a oneness of the awareness and the experience. So there isn't an entity ever that is separate from experience. So the body is part of the experience. If we sit really still, our experience of the body is visual and a little bit of sense of touch. When we close our eyes, what's left is a residual self-image. So the idea of who we are, based on seeing ourselves so regularly in life. If we close our eyes and we realize that there is a residual self-image, which is an image carried into this experience, and that if we become really present with the experience, the visual aspect of the body is not there. And if we don't move, we find that the sense of touch is very limited, and what sensations are there don't really define that there is a body, unless a whole series of thoughts add a whole story about what that sense of, that sensation that is present is. So the more present we are with the actual experience, the more that thoughts are seen as thoughts and are not necessarily a representation of what is in the experience, we find that in a meditation, even the sense of free will falls away, because there is no functioning of the body present in the experience. And so when we open our eyes again, the body suddenly appears as a visual object, and then an object relative to other objects. And so the body comes back into experience, and emotions and thoughts are there as part of the experience, and the feeling of free will is there as part of the experience. And if the belief in free will hasn't been eradicated, then not only is there the feeling of free will, but the belief in free will. And we've only mentioned it once so far. Why is there all this talk about the belief in free will? There's all this talk about the belief in free will because what we're really looking for in life as humans is happiness in daily living. And when we observe what our unhappiness is, based on a good investigation, a focused investigation, we find that our unhappiness is not actual circumstance. Our unhappiness is not circumstantial, but our attitude to circumstance, usually our attitude to painful circumstance. And painful circumstance often is there because the other or ourself have done something that has delivered an outcome which is painful to ourself or the other. And therefore, if we see that our unhappiness is attitudinal, which means our attitude to the other and to myself because of what has happened, and we see that that attitude of unhappiness arises in the form of guilt, blame, and pride, which are at its core built on the foundation of the belief in personal doership, then it makes sense that until that belief in personal doership is annihilated, the human unhappiness which arises in the form of my attitude to what the other has done and what I have done that has delivered pain to myself or someone I love or even a stranger, until that belief in personal doership is eradicated, that suffering, that human unhappiness is destined to continue. And if life brings about an eradication of the belief in personal doership, then life can no longer be seen as me and the other doing, as separate entities doing whatever happens, but rather then life is seen as a story unfolding according to destiny, a story that was put in motion at the initial impulse. So the Big Bang we can see as like an explosion. And when the bomb explodes, all of the shrapnel is set in motion. And if you had a slow motion camera of everything that happens, the shrapnel is set in motion, and everything else that is there as a result of mechanics. And so the bits of shrapnel bump into each other and deflect off each other, bump into objects and break objects or bounce off objects. And the whole movement is like a big orchestra or orchestrated movement that is happening according to the initial impulse and all of the cosmic laws that are in place. And where all the pieces of shrapnel will end and what the situation or the environment looks like at the end is completely predetermined based on the initial impulse. And the movement of humans through the world is the same as that. It's just not recognized that way. So the whole universe, if it started off at the Big Bang, was the initial impulse, energetic impulse, and then everything started banging and mixing in. And the difference is that when we look at the analogy of a bomb or the analogy of a pool table, that the white ball is struck onto the red balls and all the balls bounce off each other, it's a short duration. So it's not hard for the head to figure out that this is a series of cause and effect movements, and where everything stops and where everything is at any point in time is exactly where everything needs to be. It's very easy for us to understand that. In fact, with the pool table, if you have a computer simulator that understands the laws of the pool table and the laws of the environment, you can put all the information in, press simulate, and it will tell you where all the balls will be at any moment, and will show you a picture of where it all finishes. And if you then hit the white ball according to the same strength and angle that you inputted into the computer, lo and behold, at any moment, the balls will be exactly where the computer simulator has predicted them to be, and the final picture is going to be exactly as is on the computer screen, which shows us that once the initial impact is made and all of the laws in the universe are constant, then the outcome anywhere along the path is absolutely predetermined. So in pushing a domino, the last domino has already fallen in theory once the first domino has been pushed. And if there happens to be a gap that is too big somewhere in the chain of events, the last domino was never going to fall. And the last domino is the one just before the gap that is too big. So whatever the situation, when the first impulse is made, the situation is always predetermined to unfold exactly as it unfolded. It just takes time to unfold. And when it comes to humanity, because the number of variables are so huge, there will never be a computer that can predict exactly what is happening or what's going to happen. But in theory, the principle is the same, that the variables are all constants. The doership doesn't understand this. The sense of doership says, but every human has the potential to act however it wants. Every human can think in each moment, what will I do, without realizing that the functioning of the human is all mechanics. And so the thought that happens at any moment is actually part of the sequence of the dominoes falling, part of the sequence of the balls bumping into each other and creating shifts from one direction to the other direction. All these words, the fact that you guys are sitting here today, the fact that people on the other side of the camera, if there is such thing, are sitting watching, was all predetermined 13.8 billion years ago, if we follow the concept that the universe came into existence 13.8 billion years ago. This was all decided 13.8 billion years ago and is unfolding exactly the way it's destined to unfold. So on this line, Ramesh used to say, the fact that we see that we're not in control, there's no reason to be pessimistic, because life has put you in this situation, a situation of being exposed to concepts that can, if it's destined, be part of the change that brings about the end of suffering. You look at the vast majority of other people in life, and destiny hasn't created an interest or a movement to spend a weekend or 6 days exposed to these teachings. The fact that you are here, the fact that I am here is not my doing or your doing. It's part of life unfolding. So no reason to be pessimistic. In fact, plenty of reason to be optimistic. That life has started the journey, and once life has started the journey, why wouldn't it finish it? And if that's the case, we can sit back, relax, and know that all I need to do in life is very simple. In each moment, do whatever you think or feel to do, knowing that what it is that you actually do is not your doing. Whatever you do is exactly what was predetermined to happen, even though there is the feeling of free will in the moment. That's great. The analysis is still in each moment, which is not, this is not a prescription, this is just a description of what is always happening. In each moment, just do what you think or feel to do. No need for thinking about what I should do and what I shouldn't do, or whether the outcome is going to be good or not, or what I should have done in the past. None of that is actually required. However, if it happens, even that is predetermined to be happening. And so, hopefully, it can be watched all as a happening.
Yes, I just don't know. So the free will is in awareness, not in the human robot. The feeling of the free will.
Well, so ultimately we could say the feeling of free will is in the experience. In the experience. But what is the experience? So we could say the same about thinking. We could say, actually thinking just arises in awareness, in the experience. But when we look at what the experience is of a human being. And so it appears as if the body thinks. It appears as if I think. And so from that perspective, I could say, I have a thought. But then from that perspective of, which isn't a contradiction to everything as arising in the experience, because the experience is an experience of a human being. So I would say the feeling of free will arises inside me. Roger has the feeling of free will, understanding that Roger is actually an object in the experience. The feeling of free will is an object in the experience, but the experience is designed for it to seem like it is the body's thought, the body's free will.
this sense is made just on a belief because it's so much, how to say it, more intimate to us, this sense of the free will. When this sense of, like, this belief is dissolved, when it seems like for this observation that life is a happening, then you don't ever have a problem if there is a free will or it's not free will.
Right, so but let's be careful with the terminology. The sense of free will is a feeling.
It's a feeling, it's
a feeling. So the sense of free will doesn't dissolve, it always remains there. What you're saying is right, is when the belief in free will falls away and we find ourselves connected and at peace, then the question is, actually, who cares whether I have free will or not? I'm happy. So this is not to have an intellectual debate with someone about it. It's all of these teachings are simply to bring about change. And then it's like, who cares about all that? You know, predetermination and this and that. It's like, I'm just living my life and I'm happy. It just happens that me living my life, being happy, includes a lot of talk about this stuff. But being happy doesn't mean we have to talk about it. In fact, a very deep realization can result in someone just living life very ordinarily, going on doing their work as a plumber or a builder or a dentist or a doctor or a shopkeeper, waking up in the morning, going about their everyday duties, doing whatever needs to be done in order to look after their family, and all of that is an impulse that arises moment after moment that they recognize as driving them through life, and whatever happens is done and the person is in peace. And so talking about predestination, etc., is not important, doesn't need to happen. It's like, who cares? What is important is that the beliefs that were there before that caused the problem have been dissolved, and then even the concepts that were used to uproot the false beliefs become seen as redundant. I don't need to keep on these concepts. They've done their job. So there's the analogy I'm sure many of us have heard, is you use a boat to get from one side of the river to the other, but then you don't put the boat on your back and carry on. The boat has served its purpose, so you leave the boat in the river and keep walking. So once the tool has done its job, no need for the tool. Even all of this conceptual framework at some point dissolves and you find yourself spontaneously living life. When we look at how we spontaneously live life and we put the framework onto it, it ends up being a framework that accurately describes what's happening, but we don't need the framework for what's happening to happen. The framework is sort of just a conceptual framework describing life. So we don't need it once the false beliefs have been undone. Can we have the microphone over there?
What you just said about... Okay, so yesterday you were talking about how even though awakening or realization is not an intellectual understanding, that intellectual insights may arise on the way to that deeper understanding. And usually teachings are framed in, or how should I say this, like generally it's said that these that understanding is like the jnana path that you're describing. Understanding is needed in order to, like you're saying, undo these beliefs to get to this goal of happiness. But if we like start from the, I don't know, I guess if we've had an experience of somehow this dropping into being, and that somehow resulted in this lessening of suffering that you describe as happiness, then even though you could say, yeah, who cares, like, you know, because there's peace and happiness in daily living, is there still a value in trying to, I don't know, I still want to understand what happened, or like how that happened. I guess the framework still, even though it's an intellectual understanding that's imposed on the experiential understanding, it still seems important to have that.
So let me just frame the background for the question. Yesterday I was saying that the process of enlightenment is completely a process of the intellect. The process of enlightenment is about change on a level of the body and the mind. At many points through this process, it might not be recognized as that, and some of the insight moments that people grab hold of and put their attention on, and if we only look at that, someone will say, it's got nothing to do with the intellect. Well, actually, the insight happened because the intellect, because life has reconditioned the intellect and the body, sufficient for something at the end of a process of thought. Even if someone doesn't enter into it like a scholar where they think logically, life will still bring about circumstance and bring about thought in a way that might not be recognized as the intellect working, but it still is. And at the end of that process, what happens is a click. And the click is where the intellect sees what really is, which is actually beyond the need to intellectualize it. And because thinking is so mundane and ordinary, when the process is happening, people don't necessarily register that this is the process, mundane, ordinary thinking and what we can call contemplating. And then when the click happens, the insight, that's what is registered, and that's where it seems, And in that moment, it is the clicking out of the intellect, where the intellect sees what is and no longer needs to function. And it's seen. And then it's understand that in that moment, it's like, it's nothing to do with all of the thinking that I was doing. What is like, exists without all the thinking. So the assumption is that enlightenment is not at all intellectual, and it's true. So that's why I use the words carefully. Enlightenment itself is not intellectual. It has nothing to do with the mental superimposing of a story onto a situation. Enlightenment itself is the falling away of beliefs that kept us caught in an intellectualizing about life. Not an intellectualizing about seeking so much, but an intellectualizing about what should and shouldn't be happening, and whether that politician should be elected or not elected, and what I need my life to look like. And this is a dropping out of that story, where that story is seen to be irrelevant to what I'm really looking for. In fact, it is the obstacle to what I'm really looking for. But the process, when we look at what the process is, it's a complete process of impacting life impacting the body and the brain. It's a process where at some point the mind realizes that all this thinking is the obstacle, and it realizes that because life has delivered information prior that has primed the mind to create that conclusion and to fall away. And so during the process, if someone is curious about what is happening, that actually, to me, can be a very deep part of the process to actually understand the mechanics of what's happening, which is why I talk about it. In practice afterwards, if that understanding falls away, you can't remember it. You can't remember, let's say, all of the thinking that made up all of the insights and then delivered a final makeup, let's say, that doesn't suffer. It would be more suffering for one to think, oh, it's a shame, I don't remember it, I wish I would remember it, I better go and restudy it. Because there are plenty of people that have these insights, and then at the end of it, if someone asks them, so what happened? And they go, I don't know. It just happened. Whereas actually probably a lot more happened. If there was a recording of everything that was happening in between, it would be a very long recording of years of process. But afterwards, someone goes, I don't know, it's not relevant. They say it's not relevant because I'm happy. So I think the question is, yes, it is relevant if it's happening in the process, and it's also relevant if after the process, the understanding of what happened is destined to remain. So in my case, I find I can speak about a lot of fine details because during the process I was very aware that it just so happened that it was my destiny for there to be a watching of the thinking that was changing and how it was being changed by life impacting it a certain way. And there was an awareness of the difference between the different phases that were happening in relation to understanding each topic that presented. There were these phases of the topic coming into awareness, and then an interest in it, and then a reading about it, let's say, or life would start delivering information about that topic, then an observing the topic in action, and fine-tuning how I had interpreted the concepts that were delivered by life. And then at some point, a click would happen. And then that was like, that topic gets erased off the table. It's like done, locked into place. Next topic, please. And the process starts again. An interest in a topic, then information starts getting delivered on that topic, and then it's observed in life and a refinement of how we interpreted what the concepts that were delivered were saying. And then at some point, click, that gets swept off the table and so on. And so I happened in my process to register the process itself. Someone else may have been going through that process and it just wasn't their destiny to register that that's what's happening. And it was still happening, they just didn't register it, so then they can't really speak about it. And that's great because you have other teachings that have about 1/50th of the words that I put forward, simply because the conditioning in the teacher is different. And that's very useful to have different sorts of teachings because they deliver different things. So, do we have free will? Who's got the microphone?
we do not have free will, but we have a feeling of free will.
Yes. And is the feeling of free will the problem?
No, that is actually a gift.
Yeah. So what is the problem?
The belief that we have free will.
Oh, you get 100%. On that note, thank you.